you ready? Bonsoir et bienvenue à tous et tous. Welcome everyone, to those of you here in person as well as to those of you online. I'm Mary Hunter, a professor in art history at McGill, and it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Abigail Susik, who is an associate professor of art history at Willamette University and a founding board member of the International Society for the Study of Surrealism. Her lecture is titled Trance States, Automatist Dance, and Surrealist Sabotage, Françoise Sullivan, Les Automatistes, and Surrealist Influence in World War II era Montreal. And of course, it's wonderful to see Françoise joining us here tonight as well. Tonight's talk has been supported by the Centre International d'Art Contemporain de Montréal and McGill University's Visual Arts Collection, Libraries, and Department of Art History and Communication Studies. This evening, we are meeting on lands that have long served as a place of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous nations. We recognize, respect, and honor those nations as the traditional stewards of the lands on which we now gather. Before welcoming Professor Susik to the stage, I'd like to start by providing a short history of Françoise Sullivan's incredible work and her ties to McGill. So as we can see here, Montreal-born Françoise Sullivan is among Quebec's most renowned living artists, and last June she received a well-deserved honorary doctorate from McGill. Sullivan began her career studying visual arts at the École des beaux-arts, and then went to New York to study modern dance in the mid-1940s. In the following years, her artistic practice continued in dance, but in the late 1950s, she turned to sculpture and later painting. Her work has been the focus of numerous exhibitions and is also in major museums and private collections. To celebrate the occasion of Sullivan accepting an honorary degree from our institution, several generous donors and the Faculty of Law helped McGill's visual arts collection acquire this exquisite pastel on paper that Sullivan made in 1999, and that's what you're looking at on the screen here. Several works from the same series are currently on view in Sullivan's spectacular solo exhibition that is now down the road at the Musée des Beaux-Arts. And if you've not seen it yet, I highly advise that you go and do so. So this particular pastel was selected by the staff and students of McGill's Visual Arts Collection, not only because of the bold colors that are so representative of Sullivan's palette, but also the thin dancing lines that evoke this multidisciplinary artist's expression in modern dance. We look forward to displaying this artwork here at the Faculty of Law soon, because it was in this building that Sullivan taught modern dance classes and held performances. So in 1948, this building, now called Chancellor Day Hall, but then called the Ross House, was between purposes. It had been a private house, a military barracks, and a dormitory for McGill students. But before it became the home of the Faculty of Law, Sullivan staged performances here that would become a major turning point in Canadian dance history as the first public performances of modern dance in Montreal. On April 3rd, 1948, so the same year that she and fellow Automatist artists signed the Refus Global, Sullivan performed Dualité with Jeanne Renaud and a solo piece of jazz titled to the music Black and Tan. In the latter, she wore a costume created by Jean-Paul Mousseau and a set created by Jean-Paul Riopel. The public events on campus were surely inspiring to the community, but especially to the students enrolled in McGill's Modern Dance Club, which began in the 1930s and, like Sullivan, broke many molds. We are delighted to introduce Françoise Sullivan's visual art into the space where she pioneered modern dance as a form of not only self-expression, but also self-discovery. To help us better appreciate the profound impact of Sullivan's expansive art production, we are delighted to welcome Professor Susik, whose research focuses on the intersection of international surrealism and anti-authoritarian protest cultures. In the talk this evening, she'll also be sharing some recent research discoveries that she made while in conversation with the artist. We look forward to learning more. Please join me in welcoming Professor Abigail Susik.
Bonsoir, bonsoir, merci. I'm so delighted to be here this evening in celebration of the work and life of Françoise Sullivan. It's quite something to be lecturing about an artist who's in the audience, so a rare opportunity. And I'm delighted to see this robust audience. Thank you, everybody, for coming out on this beautiful evening in this 1892, next door to this 1892 mansion that we just heard about, the Ross House, where Sullivan had her studio for 3 years, between 1947 and 1950. And welcome to the many people who are joining us online and are streaming live. Thank you for being here. Because we are live streaming and recording, I cannot move from this spot, just so you know. But I hope that my words and the images I show you of Françoise Sullivan will dance and move around you in the most engaging way. We also cannot bring the lights down, so this will be an illuminated lecture. Art historians are mostly comfortable in the dark. I will do my best to relax. So I haven't been to Montreal for 11 years, and I'm thrilled to be back in this beautiful and friendly city with my family for the week. Je suis très heureuse à être ici avec vous, and merci beaucoup for this invitation. I also want to extend a sincere thanks to the people who made this lecture possible. Thank you to Claude Gosselin, who's the director of the Center for International Contemporary Art here in Montreal, who has been writing about Sullivan for 4 decades now. Also, I will try to relax in your presence. Also, Gwendolyn Owens, director of the Visual Arts Collection here at McGill. Thank you so much for your support. Christine Ross, distinguished James McGill Professor in Contemporary Art History Emerita, who has just retired as of yesterday. Congratulations. Jacqueline Sunderberg, also at the library here. And also thank you to Dr. Mary Hunter for that lovely introduction. And of course, I'm grateful to Françoise. This lecture is dedicated to Françoise Sullivan on the occasion of her 100th birthday in June of this year, with sincere gratitude for her encouragement of my work as a writer, as a mother, as an artist, researcher, in conversation with other artists. Over the course of our brief acquaintance, she has shown me that art and life do not need to be separate, that art feeds life, that art is life. So let us begin. I will now speak in the words of Françoise Sullivan, in terms of a conversation that we had in 2021 about the improvisational work from 1948, Danse dans la neige. This remarkable passage by Françoise has never been shared in public before, and it is taken from a forthcoming interview with her that will appear next month in the new publication, the International Journal of Surrealism. So sometimes in my lecture tonight, I will call her Françoise. Sometimes I will be more formal and call her Sullivan. Either way, her voice pervades my words tonight. So in the voice of Françoise. On that day, the whole countryside seemed to whisper. The air reddened our cheeks. The soil was rough and slippery under our feet as Jean-Paul and Maurice took silently to their task. Forgetting the familiar snows of childhood play, I stood there daring, not knowing what to dare, but daring anyway. Without rules, without guidance, I confronted this rugged terrain and chased the abyss in me. I ran down the spiky and slippery hill and danced on the edge of dance as if dance had never existed before. I ran and ran hill to hill and caressed their moon-like cover. I let movements come, vigorous in the cold, charged with the affinities of space. And here is where the rugged state of the land meets with the sublime beauty of the north in an ecstatic embrace. I followed their logic, swelled with dreams. Some birds flew by and weeds crackled under my feet. Movements followed in passionate action. I saluted a long cloud hovering over the sun. The sun became overcast at afternoon's end. The gestures were evocative, as a northern melancholy slowly descended as in a dream. So back to my own words now. In October of 2021, in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, I had the good fortune of making the acquaintance of Canadian visual artist, dancer, choreographer Françoise Sullivan, who was born here in 1923. By chance, we had happened to be seated next to one another at the opening of the Surrealism Beyond Borders exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Sullivan had traveled to the vernissage with her friend Claude Gosselin to view the installation of photographs from this improvisational dance that I've been speaking about, Danse dans la Neige, which had taken place 73 years earlier. Danse dans la Neige was part of a series of dance solos corresponding to the 4 seasons. 25 years old at the time of this performance, Sullivan engaged in an ephemeral automatism in motion in homage to the winter season and the northern landscape of Quebec. As a member of Montréal's Les Automatistes group, active between roughly 1941 and 1953 or 55, as Ray Ellenwood dates it, Sullivan's singular event, Danse dans la Neige, was documented that day, as we heard, by fellow group members, the only people who witnessed this performance. So there were 3 people there, Maurice Perrault, Maurice Perron, who took the photographs that we're seeing, and the painter Jean-Paul Riopel, who filmed the event, but the footage has since been lost, which is a real tragedy. Perron's photographs were lost actually as well until the 1970s. They were rediscovered and then reprinted, but all that remains of Riopel's intervention in is the score that he created in retrospect. So this is the score that was drawn by Riopel after the fact. This score is an intriguing cross-section between a dance notation or a dance score and an automatic drawing, which I will talk more about. A map tracing the movements of Sullivan's through the snow. So it's a sort of hybrid document, dance score, drawing, map. The installation of Perron's photographs of Sullivan's dance at the Metropolitan Museum of Art revealed her moving in the snow with an alert and calm expression, wearing gloves, a hat, ski boots, and winter clothes, as her body interacted spontaneously with the natural elements. Over the course of our conversation at the museum that night in 2021, Sullivan explained to me that her performance of bodily automatism during this dance, Danse dans la Neige, was in fact an experience of a trance state. I had so many questions about this corporeal form of automatism, its connection to the Automatist group in Quebec, and its relationship to international surrealism, that we agreed to have a conversation about these topics the following month. And so this lecture is informed by the interview that we did in November of 2021 after we happened to meet in person. It was truly by chance. And the exchanges that we've had since that time, including the conversation we had yesterday. So research is always in flux, right? So in this exhibition, Surrealism Beyond Borders, did any of you get to visit it in New York or London? Okay, just a couple of people. There were about 300 works on display. This is in 2021, 2022. So these automatist photographs of Sullivan's Danse dans la Neige were among a huge mass of works because Surrealism has been active between the 1920s and the present day around the world. It's a truly international movement over the course of 100 years. This exhibition was an attempt to understand the complex phenomenon of international surrealism from the point of an artistic movement that in fact moved beyond itself, right? So surrealism moves beyond its own centers, beyond its origins over time, and this is a good thing. And so in general, such a reprisal of surrealism is in the air and of the present moment, since the centenary of this movement, or its 100-year anniversary, is actually upon us next year in 2024. We have actually seen a remarkable wave of publications on surrealism by living surrealists and by scholars in the past decade, and then exhibitions such as Surrealism Beyond Borders, but also maybe you heard about the 2022 Venice Biennale, which also had a surrealist focus in terms of the surrealist artist Leonora Carrington. This made a lot of headlines. All of this has drawn our attention to the relevance of surrealism in recent years. So since Françoise Sullivan was never a member of the Surrealist movement, why was her work included in this exhibition, Surrealism Beyond Borders? The Quebecois group Les Automatistes refused on principle adherence to Surrealism, despite the fact that Surrealist luminary André Breton expressly invited members of the group to join Surrealism, and despite their deep interest in aspects of Surrealism's diverse experiments and investigations. So there was definitely a rapport between les Automatistes and Surrealism, but always les Automatistes held their distance. Moreover, you might be asking yourself, and rightly so, what is a scholar of Surrealism like myself intending to accomplish with the consideration of the work of Françoise Sullivan in relationship to Surrealism, and a discussion of this notion of Surrealist influence upon her entirely original body of work. When we met at the Met in 2021, I had in fact already known about Sullivan's work for some years prior, and I had longed to have the chance to speak with her about Danse dans la Neige in particular, the images of which had haunted me in an uncanny manner like a dream. So it's as if I had already experienced somehow those images when I encountered them. I had traveled to the Surrealism show in New York because I contributed an essay to the catalog, I'll stay here for a second, about the radical protest activities of the Chicago group of Surrealists in the 60s and 70s. So I was already invested in this idea of a post-World War II American Surrealism, really a North American Surrealism, and the relationship of Surrealism to social resistance movements. I had been working on researching also the artwork of Canadian artists like Jean Benoit, Mimi Perron, and Alan Glass. And so I had begun to encounter images of Françoise's work prior to meeting her. Mimi Perron and Jean Benoit were Quebecois artists who moved to France and became surrealists in the 1950s. They are also signatories of the important Prisme Dieu manifesto, which was issued by Alfred Pellan and others in February of 1948. And maybe you know this manifesto was a sort of competitor to the Refus Global manifesto that Les Automatistes signed. I had also begun an elaborate research project on the artist on the right, who named Alan Glass, who was a Montreal-based artist, quite an incredible practitioner who worked in the medium of assemblage, as you can see here. He left Quebec in the early 50s and went to France and became a surrealist too, and then spent the rest of his life in Mexico. So this sort of repertoire of North American surrealisms, para-surrealisms, post-surrealisms was building in my mind. And so now the current book project that I have, my second book, will include a chapter on Françoise Sullivan in this context of a surrealist dance in North America and beyond. So I reassure you that my intention is by no means to appropriate Sullivan's oeuvre for the benefit of the Surrealist archive. Instead, I argue that following Sullivan's own comments to me in our 2021 interview, that she strove to go further than surrealism in her work, extending beyond surrealism's limited automatism and rooting it in the intuitive consciousness of the landscape, an embodied and liberatory form of gendered automatism that in my mind actually fulfills something that surrealism itself was not able to complete. So this word automatism is, of course, at the core of surrealist practice. And if you don't know much about it, I will talk more about it ahead. But the idea is that any practitioner or novice can quiet the waking consciousness of the rationalized workaday world, this work mindset that we have, in order to sabotage productivity and the work ethic, in order to allow access to the fluid unconsciousness during the day, right? So there's a way in which you shut off the waking mind in order to access the kind of freedom of the dream state. That is the idea of surrealist automatism, right? And so I'll talk a little bit more about it ahead, but what Françoise Sullivan does is update and improve surrealist automatist efforts, activating them from the identity standpoint of a young female working in the northern reaches of North America, and this continent of North America. Although, once again, I confess that I am not the ideal candidate to speak of a northern consciousness because I'm from Florida, subtropical Florida, and Tampa today enjoyed weather of 80 degrees. I do want to assert that what I see as the power and strength of Sullivan's regional Quebecois automatism is one way in which we can see surrealism productively moving, dancing, roaming beyond itself, as it were. She was never reliant on any recognition from surrealists or scholars of surrealism like myself, but I firmly believe that in a kind of reverse osmosis, surrealism needs Sullivan. and that its project of psychic and social liberation depends on its living relevance and utility to practitioners like Sullivan, who can seize and deploy its tools for their own purposes within their unique milieus. As a member of Les Automatistes, Sullivan shows us how aspects of surrealist practice and surrealist automatism in painting, dance, poetry, and sculpture can resist or defy social strictures in 1940s Quebec and beyond in place and time, even while her work constantly calls us back to the pleasure of the present moment in this place where we are now, here tonight, in our own bodies. Sullivan's embodied and eco-conscious automatism is a fulfillment of an impulse that surrealist automatism longed for and arguably imagined, but was never fully able to achieve. So, thus, in order to comprehend this embodied regional automatism, now let us return to Sullivan's form as it moves across the snowy landscape here in Quebec in 1948. We are in Otterburn Park at the home of Jean-Paul and Françoise Riopel on February 28, 1948. Riopel had just moved back from France with his wife and their 2-month-old baby, and Françoise was delighted at his unexpected invitation just the previous day to realize her dream of dancing in the snow. So they met at a lecture. Riopel is just back from France. She mentions her dream of doing this dance in the snow, and he says, well, come to my house tomorrow and we'll do it. And she says, okay. There was no prior planning for this event. It was totally spontaneous and occurred over the course of a walk through this snowy countryside. Yesterday, Sullivan told me that on that day she took the bus to the Riopel home and that she wasn't sure which stop to get off at first over the course of this hour or so long ride. She wore an overcoat because this winter of 1948, a few years after the conclusion of World War II, was a real winter, in her own words, different from the winters experienced today in this region as a result of global warming. Under her coat, she was dressed in a few layers of sweaters, and the topmost sweater was dark green. I really relished learning that detail, which must have provided a very striking contrast to the stark and reflective expanse of snow around her as she moved in this trance dance. So this was a site-specific improvisation that unfolded as a response to the ephemeral textures, as she called it, of the place. The sites for the dance were chosen by Françoise in relation to an imagined scenario about the place that arose over the course of the group's walk through the countryside. So 4 people walking along, right? She explained to me that she had directed the fellow automatists with the camera devices, Perron and Riopel, to stand far back, so quite far away from her, even though they stood shoulder to shoulder, very close to one another as they filmed her and photographed her as she moved, right? So that's a very interesting. The photographs of the dance, as they are collected, suggest that there were sections or movements that corresponded to different locations of this landscape, chosen, at some randomness by Sullivan. And indeed, the 1970s re-edition of the photographs by Perron included numbered images, suggesting an order or sequence for these images. And I want to thank Claude Gosselin for allowing me to show a picture of his living room. Thank you. This is Claude's installation. So it's quite clear that these gestures were dynamic and fluid, but certain shots also suggest, as we've been discussing this week, poses or pauses in the gestures to allow for the capturing of photographs and filmic sequences. The cameras, therefore, became extensions of the dance in that sense. The black and white film only accentuated the lunar appearance of the location, emphasizing the otherworldliness of this Canadian landscape. So, by this time, Sullivan had been studying classical dance and ballet since the age of 11. But 3 years earlier, in 1945, she had begun to break away from the strictures of these formalized modes of dance. As a teenager, she had enrolled in, as we heard with Mary earlier, in drawing and painting classes at the Montréal École de beaux-arts between 1939 and 45. And this is where she began to learn about the European avant-garde, including movements such as Surrealism, Cubism, and Fauvism. And it was actually pretty difficult, from what I've heard, to get good information on these movements like Surrealism because of the censorship, the index, which I've heard about. So the young artists kind of did what they could and worked together to get publications that were banned here in Montréal or in Quebec. So it was in 1941 that her friend Pierre Gavreau introduced her to the professor and painter Paul-Émile Borduas, who was at that time a professor at the École des Meubles in Montréal. Accompanied by other friends, including Louise Renaud, Magdalene Desroches, and Fernand Leduc, meetings began with Borduas that led to the formation of this important group, Les Automatistes. So, thus, it's essential to recognize that by the time that Danse dans la Neige occurred at the beginning of 1948, Sullivan had already been part of the Automatist group for 7 years, even though she was only 25 years old at the time of the Snowy Dance. As early as 1943, she participated in exhibitions such as Maurice Gagnon's Les Sagittaires show at the Dominion Gallery of Fine Arts in Montréal, where she showed 2 paintings, including a portrait of an Indigenous child. At the suggestion of Borduas in 1943, she had published an essay, Feminine Painting, in the University of Montréal newspaper. It's interesting, an essay on feminine painting. It's quite fascinating that she published that so early in 43. And then later that same year in 43, Françoise met the French painter Fernand Léger, who is, of course, one of the great members of the European avant-garde. They had such a great rapport that he actually was invited to Sullivan's home where he gave her a private drawing lesson. And as you can see from this wonderful photograph that's on the screen, she also attended the summertime meetings of the Automatist group at the Charbonneau Forum in Saint-Hilaire, living in close quarters with other artists in this milieu, and then each autumn also regularly attending the sessions at Borduas's apartment on Napoleon Street with Automatist colleagues such as Jean-Paul Mousseau, the Gauvreau brothers, and the Renaud sisters. And this just looks like so much fun to me. I just feel like we all need to kind of activate this community in our lives, this wonderful summertime gathering of these young students. So in the spring of 1945, her approach to dance was transformed when she moved to New York City, as you heard, where she shared an apartment in Greenwich Village with Louise Renaud and studied dance with a number of different groups and teachers, such as the New Dance Group, Hanya Holm, Martha Graham, Louis Horst, and on occasion La Marie and Pearl Primus. She ultimately enrolled, and this is just a fascinating chapter, in the Franziska Boas Dance Studio, where she remained for 2 years until 1947, returning to Quebec for part of the summer in 46. So if you don't know, Franziska Boas was the daughter of the famed anthropologist Franz Boas, and her mother, Marie Krakowitzer, was also an anthropologist, and Boas was well known for working on indigenous groups, particularly groups from the Pacific Northwest coast where I live, in the region of Cascadia. So this background of her parents certainly influenced Franziska Boas, who was interested in the potential of improvisational dance to overcome racial barriers, in particular across the black-white divide in the United States, just as she was drawn to indigenous dance and kept indigenous instruments in her studio that the students could use. She also focused on the development of dance therapy for mental illness. Her 1944 book, The Function of Dance in Human Society, would also have been an important document for Sullivan at this time, right? So just published a few years before, actually the year before Sullivan arrives at the studio. So at the Franziska Boas studio, Sullivan actually organizes the very first official exhibition of the Les Automatistes group. It was a show called the Borduas Group, and it was actually in the Boas studio where the artworks were hung. Then when she returns to Montreal in 1947, she sets up studio here in the Ross House next door. It's quite incredible. Begins teaching and actually begins moving toward her own spontaneous compositions. So here's a quote from our interview that we did in 2021 about this period from Françoise. For my part, the summer of 1947, I got a studio here and began to give classes in modern dance technique as well as working on new choreographies. I had been working on Black and Tan, which was a dance based on Duke Ellington's Black and Tan fantasy, and then on Daedalus, Dualité, and Gothique, as well as other dances that are iconic from this period. The Automatist group met occasionally and many things were discussed, but I was not always at those discussions as I was very busy. During Christmas holiday, I worked on my text, La Danse et l'Espoir, Dance and Hope. I was surprised to be asked to present it publicly in 1948, as I thought it needed a little polishing. Very humble, right? So this text, this amazing text, Dance and Hope, was of course published in the collected version of Borduas's Le Feu Global Manifesto, which was released in August of 1948 and signed by members of the Automatist group. So this was a few months after Danse dans la Neige took place, right? And Dance and Hope was the only text by a woman to be published in this manifesto of Les Automatistes, although a number of other female artists were signatories of Borduas's protest document, which rejected Quebecois social mores at the time and called for a, quote, untamed need for liberation, a resplendent anarchy, and it condemned the suffocating oppressiveness enforced by the religious and government hegemony at the time in Quebec. The first lines of Dance and Hope read, quote, more than anything else, dance is a reflex, a spontaneous expression of intense emotion. People have found in dance a way of satisfying an inner need to feel the touch in touch with the universe. The dancer, becoming one with motion, is at the turning point of all four dimensions. Within the bounds of the human body, there is infinite variety, which draws sustenance from the core of life itself, end quote. Beautiful. Sullivan describes Balinese dance in particular as a prime example of trance dance. But in this essay, she is also interested in the connection of dance to ancient religion in general and sacred mystery. So in our interview about this period, Françoise said that the recital de danse that was here in the Ross House in 1948 was a way in which to get everybody participating, or many of the members of the Automatist group. Mousseau created a stage using yards and yards of jute, as well as a costume that we will see in a moment. Riopel decided to be the régisseur, director. Claude Graveau recited Thérèse's poem. Pierre Mercure created music, and Maurice Perrin did the stage lighting. And so Borduas, in writing this text about this protest text, Refus Global, this was a sort of last-minute idea, according to Françoise. She says, there were no formal meetings about the manifesto, nor organized plans, but Borduas's text was virulent. I was surprised to see that the group decided to include my text, La Danse et l'Espoir. It was surely less provocative than Borduas's main text, but it had a connection to it. On the eve of assembling the contents, some members would have preferred to be less political. Riopel, for one, argued and cried out, it's about painting, painting, painting. However, he participated and various texts were assembled, the manifesto was published, and it had more to do with social spheres. So the text was published in an edition of 400. You see the page with Françoise's text here. And as is history now, you probably know that Borduas lost his job, his family, and his health, but he kept his friends. So there was a huge reaction to this political manifesto that was extremely hard on Borduas in particular. And then the manifesto was forgotten for about 10 years until younger artists began to cite it and address it. So here in this video with some sound, we can watch a portion of a reprisal of Sullivan's Black and Tan mentioned just now, with this music by Duke Ellington from 1947. So this was performed next door. With Mousseau's costume design. So, I hate to take it away from you, I'm sorry, but you can find more online. I can give you the link. So given this rich and complex historical context and Sullivan's already extensive exposure to modern art and dance trends by 1948, when Danse dans la Neige takes place, how can we understand Danse dans la Neige in the larger context of her work with Les Automatistes, and also in relationship to this idea of a surrealism that is surpassed and fulfilled, as I have argued? As Sullivan once explained in 2018, Danse dans la Neige was not a choreography. It was, quote, a venture into unexplored territory, a step into the unknown, an art of the moment. In the Hyperborean landscape at the foot of Mont Saint-Hilaire, Sullivan danced without prior conception, and her body moved spontaneously in response to these psychological and physiological impulses. As is now well known, this dance was actually the second motion in an improvisation for 4 parts, right? It's a dance of 4 seasons. So this is the winter dance. On this conception, scholar Noémie Solomon wrote in 2018, quote, each act was meant to be danced in close connection with a place, a season, the movement corresponding to the textures of a terrain, becoming entangled in the particularities of the weather that pervades as time passes. During the previous summer of 1947, Sullivan's mother was the sole witness, along with the birds and the whales, to the first motion of this dance of the seasons, Danse pour l'été, for summer. And this took place on the north shore of the ocean-like saltwater St. Lawrence River at the lost village of Les Escoumins. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. So yesterday, Françoise explained to me that at that time, this area of Quebec was quite remote and difficult to access, since you had to take a number of different boats between the different bodies of water, right? There were sort of marshy areas and lots of bodies of water. Françoise and her mother had been staying during the summer vacation with a very strict Catholic family, and sort of in this social milieu, dance was totally forbidden, even kind of innocent types of dance like square dancing, right? So in response to this social atmosphere, which contrasted so starkly with the wild physical beauty of the environment, Françoise asked her mother to use the family Bolex camera to film her dancing on an island that was populated by a series of pink granite boulders that had been used to build a small church, which still stood nearby at the time. Sullivan was barefoot and wore a red leotard. As you probably know, red is her favorite color. And this leotard had long sleeves but no covering on the legs. And as I said, she was barefoot. Such a historical context for this first summer dance of the seasons cycle by Sullivan alerts us to the fact that les Automatistes were dissident artists, right, in this period. So in advance of the Quiet Revolution of the 60s, a dance like this summer dance is a rebellion act. These seasonal dances are not just an homage in a classical sense to the changes in weather and climate, right? The idea of seasons is a very traditional idea in art, but rather a testimony to the social youth revolution that was building and taking place in Quebec after World War II. So just to be clear, this is not Françoise. We have no images of Françoise. There's no footage. The footage is lost. But we have the reprisal that was done, as you can see, in 2007 with the curator Louise Darry and Françoise, and various dancers to give us a sense of all 4 of the seasons in this imagined 4-part dance. So this is a quote from Françoise about the dance. On that day, from our interview, on that day I put on my red leotard and started to dance on this island in the bright sunlight where whales spurt water and jump and dance. I danced with the whales and my hair was in flames under the sun. I had asked my mother to film this extravagance, and she did, loving participating with her daughter in an event so surrealist, in her own words. So it's just a remarkable dance where we could see, I mean, I imagine it, and I imagine it in all of its color as Sullivan describes it, this intense relationship with the landscape and the light, and also the interaction with the eye of the camera that her own mother held. Françoise danced and actually gave directions to her mother as she danced, so the filming was collaborative in that regard. And unfortunately, it is lost. The film was, she said, made in the radiant sunlight, showing the brightest of colors. There was the blue sea, the white breakers, the pink granite, the red of my leotard, the brown of the pale earth, the unpainted shack along the point, and the green weeds and the green of the distant hills. This palette is rich. We must imagine it in our minds. So the second and third movements of this 4 seasons improvisation never took place in the original moment in the 40s. The second iteration of this dance was envisioned as a spring dance in the rain in Old Montréal, so an urban dance, quite wonderful. And the third dance would have taken place in the forest in honor of autumn, the autumn season. The extreme ephemerality of Sullivan's Dance of the Seasons was therefore only accentuated by the half-realized nature of the piece, and therefore in the missing footage for 2 of its completed parts. However, we can see that this work is absolutely striking, both in the way in which it corresponds to various aspects of international surrealism over the course of the 20th century, and because of its unique qualities specific to Sullivan's participation in the Les Automatistes group. So, in essence, I argue that Sullivan's Danse dans la Neige is significant for the history of surrealism, as I've said, because of this adaptation of automatism into this site-specific dance and this question of trance state. And I'll sort of outline how it might interact with surrealism here, right? It's a crucial extension of surrealism because it allows the body to become itself the automatist drawing tool, inhabited or occupied by the surrounding environment, so as to inscribe space with a responsive and intuitive movement and gesture, right? So it's a form of telepathy with the natural world, rather. It's a reception and a transmission from place, right? So the body becomes the automatic instrument. So I argue that Sullivan is enacting a dance-based psychogeography 7 years before Guy Debord and the Situationist International would appropriate the notion of the dérive, or unplanned journey, wandering drift. So I'm interested in comparing Sullivan's Danse dans la Neige and other dances in the seasons to surrealist automatic drawing, surrealist trance states, and something called the Surrealist dérive, which was something that was appropriated by this group called the Situationist International in the 1950s. So I'll explain what the dérive is in a moment if you don't know it, right? And I will say, as I mentioned, the Situationist International, it's very interesting that Sullivan knew Guy Debord, quite well in the 1970s in Italy, and Debord stayed with Sullivan, or stayed at Sullivan's place in Italy for a period. So there's this genealogical relationship to this idea of a kind of surrealist wandering that is linked to surrealism and situationism. Also, we can also begin to think about the place of Sullivan's work in a kind of dance genealogy of surrealism that might include artists such as Maya Deren and Alice Farley, who's with us here in the audience, and I'll return to Alice, in order to think about this legacy of surrealist dance or automatist dance in the United States. So although Sullivan's Dance for the Seasons can only be tangentially linked to the situationist deployment of the dérive as a tool for psychogeography in the city, I want to perform a brief comparison of this idea of the dérive, right? The surrealist dérive, or drift, activated surrealist objective chance and spatialized the practice of automatism in an environmental field of transmissions. In 1924, as we can see here from the sole existing photograph, Louis Aragon, André Breton, and Max Maurice and Roger Vitrac, these are surrealists from France in the initial period of that movement, they commenced an aimless journey from the French town of Blois into another town. So they actually, in 1924, these new surrealists, it's a new movement, they get together and they get a map out of France and they close their eyes and they point at random to a spot on the map. Then they head out to that spot, right? This is a very Dadaistic fashion of choosing at random. And they head out to that spot and they actually walk between two cities. It's a kind of aimless wandering moment in which a small collective group can kind of experience the unknown. This is a physical form of automatism, a physical form of the unconscious, right? They described it as an enterprise strewn with perils, fantasies, and hallucinations, although we have very little documentation of it. More than 30 years later, Guy Debord's situationist text theory of the dérive from 1956 was described as a form of emotional disorientation. He said it was, quote, a mode of experimental behavior linked to the conditions of urban society, a technique of rapid passage through varied ambiances. And these are various situationist charts showing this idea of the wandering dérive through the city. The city is really important for the situationists. Notice how they look a little bit like a dance score or dance steps. I think that's quite interesting, right? So the aim here, as Debord says, we can see, quote, in a dérive, one or more persons during a certain period drop their usual motives for movement and action, their relations, their work, and their leisure activities, and they let themselves be drawn by the attractions of the terrain and the encounters they find there. But the dérive includes both this letting go and its necessary contradiction, domination of psychogeographical variations by the knowledge and calculation of their possibilities. That's a little wordy at the end there, but basically they're interested in this idea of sabotaging our kind of routine habits of moving through the city as a regulated space, right? They talked about every space in the city, every space in the world, really, as a police space. They were ardent anti-capitalists and Marxists, so this was a form of resistance to the capitalist world. So returning to Danse dans la neige, we can see just how distinctive this dance was in terms of an automatism of the body rooted in the experience of its immediate environment. Nearly a decade ahead of the Situationists and Debord, Sullivan was rethinking the paradigm of the Surrealist dérive in a North American context and from a female gendered point of view. 3 of the 4 of these dances were to take place in a non-urban context, as we have seen, right, during the rain, in the forest, etc., and finally in old Montréal. She appears to select these environments in relationship to the particularities of the geographic terrain. But instead, I want to argue that Danse dans la neige functions more like a surrealist automatic drawing, which we see an example of here. This is by the surrealist artist André Masson, again from that early period of surrealism's announcement in the 1920s. And what Masson has done here is kind of let his hand wander on the page, right? Ideally sort of shutting down his mind, letting the body take over in this sort of almost robotic kind of way. I want to compare the two. The body channels the energy of the place in Sullivan's dance, and pure movement is produced rather than pure thought. This is a physical automatism, not a verbal one. The body moves spontaneously, resisting formulated gestures and learned patterns, responding instead to the sensorium of immediate surroundings, losing the self in the natural space, en plein air, rather than confronting the self or liberating the self from the field of phenomenon. So this is quite different from a surrealist or a situationist operation. I'm interested in the process of communing with nature's energies, this somatic tenor of winter versus summer, and what that's like in the lived moment. These questions speak to the notion of the human as an animal, or the question of how bodily experience exceeds the material limitations of a capitalist system on a moment-to-moment basis, right? So how is dance written in real time by the body? How is the body a kind of receptor for nature itself? Such a notion of this body as a dematerialized site for automatism responds and speaks to some of the issues that were floating around the Automatist group in this period of the 40s and into the 50s. So, as you know, they were very indebted in certain regards to Surrealism. They talk a lot about Surrealism in their texts, but they resist this affiliation. They were interested actually more in an empathetic or intuitive communing with the experience of being in the world rather than recording the movement of the unconscious. So this, abstraction is predominantly important for les automatistes, right? But there's another key bridge between Sullivan's danced automatism and surrealist automatism. This idea that trance state was a key component of both. So I'm returning again to this idea of trance. In our conversation, Sullivan confirmed with me that some of her dances were completed entirely in a trance state. When I asked her about this in conjunction with her study of dance in the US, she said, quote, "In New York in the late 1940s, I can remember that everybody was interested in Jung and Freud at the time. Everyone was talking about dreams. Everyone wanted to see a psychoanalyst. The only way these theories were apparent in my work was through dreams and poetry. I remember one night after an improvisation class, this would have been at Boas's studio probably, I wanted to continue to dance all night long, but they stopped me at 10:30. That time I was actually in a trance." And we see this amazing photograph of Sullivan here, probably in New York, in 1947, in this kind of ecstatic movement. The choreography for Dualité, as well as Danse dans la neige, were surely close to a kind of Freudian theory in her mind, as she states. And so as far as I understand, there was no trance aspect of the situationist dérive in this practice of what they called psychogeography. There's no trance aspect. It was a kind of conscious reaction to capitalism. Debord described it as an objective critique of capitalism. However, this experience of the trance, as you may know, is foundational to Surrealism, and it could be called the surrealist experience par excellence. The Automatist trance sessions of Surrealism's Epoque Floue began in September of 1922 in the transitional period between Dada and Surrealism, when group members like Robert Desnos and René Crevel became interested in this intermediary psychosomatic state between wakefulness and sleep. And these were sort of famous practitioners within Surrealism of the trance state. They could be fully hypnotized and kind of spew this automatic language. They would move around to some degree. Mostly they were static and reclined, as you can see Desnos here. But this is a non-spiritualist, right? They were not interested in ghosts and the spiritual world, but they were interested in the possibility of telepathy and mind reading, mind sharing through automatic language as a kind of prophetic utterance. So there were not really many instances that we know of in the 1920s in Surrealism that included a kind of moving automatism. These trance states, usually the person would be seated or even reclining. They were immobile. The body was shut down in order to allow the language from the mind to come forth, right? And we see these photographs of Desnos just passed out, right? Sometimes in a cafe, probably after a few cocktails, but in this case, he's truly in a trance. And the members of the group would kind of stenographically copy or write down the language that was coming supposedly directly from the unconscious mind. There is one story of, let's see where I have it here, one of the members of the group actually getting on all fours and acting like a dog and eating dog food. But that's the only example I know of a surrealist moving dramatically during automatism. It was about the body's docile passivity. So obviously, Danse dans la neige is the reverse of the surrealist sommeil, or the surrealist sleep. Sullivan's constantly moving, sensing, and undulating body takes the place of Desnos's fluid, streaming language, while it appears that the mind, or at least speech, becomes dormant. Sullivan is perhaps closer to a sleepwalking trance than Desnos's oracular, hypnotic semi-slumber. Her body is akin to an instrument of the elements, a kind of weather vane for the randomness of a living world. And so here is another resonance with surrealism that is kind of lingering under the surface of my interest in this work. As I've written about in my book, Surrealist Sabotage and the War on Work, there were these female adepts, these female kind of practitioners of automatism in the 20s, such as Simone Cohn-Britton, André Breton's wife, who were really skilled at either written or spoken automatism. But I'm also thinking about the work of automatism, the work of Catherine Conley, who's a really important surrealism scholar who writes about automatism. And she talks about a kind of écriture féminine, woman's writing or female writing, feminine writing, in this 1996 book, Automatic Woman. And there we can see that there's this other layer of the trance state beyond spoken automatism by a practicing surrealist. And maybe you see where I'm going with this, this question of the surrealist interest in hysteria. In particular, the hysterical fits of female patients who were photographed by the French neurologist and professor of anatomical pathology, Jean-Martin Charcot, in the late 19th century. This is a famous patient of his, Augustine, who was relentlessly photographed as she experienced these so-called fits of hysteria, which, as you probably know, is a disease that doesn't exist, right? It's never existed. I'm really interested. It's great to think about a non-existent disease. So the connection here is that Breton and other male surrealists in the 1920s actually attempted to imitate the hysterical fit in their pursuit of automatism and the trance state. They were interested in kind of inducing a type of hysteria, as problematic as that may seem, certainly from a gendered point of view. And the legacy of this is the arrival, fairly late in the movement in the 1930s, of surrealist dance. And that surrealist dance is absolutely infused with this idea of hysteria. I don't know if you know about this famous dance by the surrealist Helene Van Nel, which was performed in 1938 at a Surrealist International exhibition. And you can see that she is sort of imitating or enacting the fugue state, the hysterical fit that we had seen with before here with Augustine. So Salvador Dali was there for this performance of Van Nel, and he said this about it. Just imagine his agitated voice. She jetted from the wings like a tornado in an unbelievable movement that had induced a demential delirium within all attendants. She created a total uproar with her violent entrance, lunging onto the bed, holding at arm's length a live rooster, which cackled in terror. She herself began screaming in hysteria as she rolled and contorted herself on the bed. She's performing on a bed, as you can see. She jumped up and down before throwing herself into the pond that's surrounded by reeds that we had set up in the middle of the room. So clearly, Vanel's theatrical dance hysteria is totally different from Sullivan's dance work, including Danse dans la neige. But we must remember that Sullivan was concretely interested in trance and wrote in her essay, Dance and Hope, from the same year that, quote, the dancer must liberate the energies of his body through movements that are spontaneously directed to him. He can do so by putting himself in a state of receptivity similar to that of a medium. Through the violence of the forces at work, he may even reach a trance-like state and make contact with the points of magic. Through automatism, the dancer rediscovers in his body these points and tensions, and as he follows on his own individual impulses and dynamism, goes beyond individual towards the universal. A universe is created, an entire world breathes. He can be moved by the pathos or transported by ecstasy. The spectacle must act upon him, change something in him that is the source of its usefulness, its magic. An amazing quote that, again, suggests all of these resonances, right, pointing to the surrealist dance tradition and maybe even ahead to André Breton's project from the early 50s, L'art magique, magic art. So there are other really important examples of this dance genealogy that I can't really go into detail about here, but I think I can briefly mention that the American dancer and filmmaker and multimedia artist Maya Deren is important to consider here. Deren also was not a surrealist, but she revolved around surrealist groups and was very close with a number of surrealists. She discusses in an important essay in 1942 called Religious Possession and Dancing this idea of trance and hysteria. This was followed up by the unedited footage completed posthumously from her trip to Haiti on a Guggenheim Fellowship where she filmed Haitian voodoo rituals in the Rada and Petro services. And then, as you may know, her first two films kind of begin this idea of the body moving spontaneously in a fluid space, but is only really realized in her third film, which is Study in Choreography for Camera from 1945, where this incredible, it's just an absolutely beautiful film, the dancer Tally Beatty moves between different kinds of environments, and the film allows for these cuts that are seamless. So on the one moment, Beatty's outside, and the next moment, he's in a living room dancing, etc. So it's something that a film critic called choreo cinema, a type of cinema that allowed for a new type of choreographic dance. So there's a real link to the Sullivan Saison project here. But I want to be careful to note that Sullivan, despite these studies with Francisca Boas in New York and her shared interest in indigenous dance, was careful to say that ethnography was not her project, right? So Sullivan says what she's doing is not ethnographic dance. This is from Dance and Hope. She states, quote, "It must be clearly understood that the dancer does not choose a type of dance. This is not a question of ethnology, but of contemporary life. Art can only flourish if it grows from the problems that concern the age, and it is always pushed in the direction of the unknown, hence the marvelous within it." So Sullivan describes this interest in the role of dance in antiquity in Dance and Hope, and also the roots of dance in the Judeo-Christian world and in Asia. She discusses tribal dance to some degree and the notion of shamanic rites in relationship to dance, but she does not take an explicitly anthropological approach like Deren does. This is key. Now, if we really wanted to excavate a genealogy, I might mention things like the not very well-known film Introspection by American filmmaker Sarah Catherine Arledge, which has this kind of double exposure dance from 1946, and I think far less successfully something like a surrealist performance by the Swiss artist Merit Oppenheim, who actually did her own tribute to the spring season with a performance involving not the artist, the body of the artist, and actually it's a mannequin here, but initially it was a live nude model who was hired to kind of be the tray on which the sort of abundance of spring was served to, as you can see, André Breton and others as part of the 1959 Eros exhibition in Paris, right? So there is an interest in the female body in relationship to the seasons, the notion of ancient rites, the kind of goddess formulations in surrealism as well. However, they're by far the most substantial connection between Sullivan's work and the legacy of surrealist dance lies in a comparison with the work of contemporary American surrealist Alice Farley, who's here tonight. And maybe you can talk with Alice afterward if you're interested. So now I get the pleasure of showing you very rare and remarkable images from Farley's dance Land's End, which was at the Sutro Baths in San Francisco in 1978. I'm going to move through a number of images that Alice was kind enough to send me that I could share tonight. This was a complex event that she can probably describe far better than I can. But there were 15 characters that appeared over 1 mile of distance in the cliffs above these ruined baths in San Francisco, an incredibly beautiful space. There was an audience that was led by 3 double-masked guides through the woods, where a wheeled woman entangled in ships floated above the trees, and other figures also interacted. And then, as you can see, the cliffs were used quite extensively in this dance. And my favorite aspect of it is the maybe happenstance, I don't know, I'll have to ask Alice, use of the red garment. Right, the red garment in the outdoor automatist American dance here. An incredible synergy with Danse dans l'été by Françoise. And so Farley was involved with different surrealist groups in America, and that's a complex history. And she also trained with Martha Graham, as did Farley, along with other teachers over the course of her life in New York and elsewhere. But Farley wrote to me about automatist dance the following, quote, "Automatism in dance is most clear, but not so easy. The body is much more controlled by its habits, its limitations, than the painter or the poet's hand. I found for myself that half of the battle to forge an automatic path in movement is fighting the training that has become ingrained in the muscle. This jump always ends this way, this position always resolves to this, I can only do this, a teacher might say. So I found that there was a preparation necessary, a conscious choice to subvert the habitual rhythm or the learned flow of movements." And she goes on to talk about this lack of predictability becoming visible in madness, trance, and hysteria. So this is a tantalizing set of connections between Farley and Sullivan, and this sort of idea of the role of liberation in the liberation from the oppressive cultures of Western societies, the ability of automatist dance to sabotage our productivist mindsets caught in the capitalist grind. In Dance and Hope, Sullivan makes it clear that liberation is a key preoccupation for les automatistes. She says, quote, "All of our forces must be directed toward liberation, towards a rediscovery of ecstasy and love." This is Françoise. And now as I conclude, I'll just say that taking stock of Sullivan's remarkable body of work in painting, sculpture, dance, text, performance, site-specific work, and various collaborations, I can see the way in which this liberatory force of automatism pervades her art as a whole. From the welded, fabricated sculptures that she began to create in 1959 after the birth of her 3rd son, she raises 4 sons total, incredible, to the conceptual walking pieces or promenades from the early 1970s, in which Sullivan sought to protest the so-called death of painting as a relevant genre in contemporary art. We can see this continued centrality of body, place, space, and free movement in her work. And yesterday, Françoise described to me this promenade between the 2 museums that I'm showing you here in Montreal as a wandering dérive. in which a photograph was taken on every corner at random with no aesthetic choice, right? So even though some of the photographs are very beautiful, these photographs were taken at random during this derive between the two museums. It was such a drifting walk that the cops actually picked her up during the walk and said, "What are you doing here?" and made her move along. I didn't know that. I really enjoyed learning that. So even more key to the totality of her oeuvre is the role of painting, which she returned to in 1980. And I think of her performance Je Pars from 1993, which was reprised in 2017 at the Galerie Luquam. The performer wears a canvas created by Sullivan and spins around and around like a Sufi whirling dervish, chanting a text by Sullivan. And Sullivan admires Sufi dancers. The dancer spins only until she can no more, so the ending depends on the body of the dancer. Here, painting literally comes alive in the fusion of dance through language and painterly flow. So this is a reprisal of the performance in more recent years. Yesterday, as we walked through her current exhibition at the Musée des Beaux-Arts here in Montreal, it's called I Let Rhythms Flow, appropriately, Françoise explained to me that the stunning cycle of color-filled paintings in acrylic painted in 2022 and mostly in 2023, just last year, it's a huge number of paintings, it's an incredible body of work for 1 year, is a response, in fact, to the seasons. So we come full circle, right, to the Saisons dances of the late 1940s and Danse dans la neige, to Sullivan's new work currently on display here in Montreal. And it allows us to ponder how time has changed with our changing relationship to weather and to the seasons in the era of climate change and what some people are now calling the Pyrocene, the age of fire and other extreme weather events here in Canada and around the world. But rather than terrifying us further with apocalyptic threats, Sullivan's work nudges us toward a more intuitive and interconnected rapport with the natural world. Living in and working near natural spaces continues to be of paramount importance to Sullivan. I think it's only fitting that the largest mural in Montreal was unveiled last month, a tribute to the Quebec artist Françoise Sullivan, that's on the corner of St. Catherine and St. Hubert streets. I think 10 artists did 2 months of work to complete this, and it took 1,200 liters of paint. And it's an amazing tribute to Sullivan and her 100th birthday. So briefly, I would like to close with words from Françoise once again, because that's where we started. This is from our interview regarding her relationship to surrealism, and the importance of intuition and spontaneity in her work. She says of the Automatist, "We thought of ourselves as the avant-garde. We had initially embraced surrealism as it was then the most advanced movement, but we strove to go further. The consciousness of being on the frontier, of being ahead rather than the behind, of having no model of encounter, felt images that are intuitively felt." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abigail, for that rich and really delightful discussion.
Thank you.
I was hoping that you could stay for a couple questions. We have some time.
And I'm happy to flip back to images if people have questions about specific things. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Wendy.
Yeah, you will have to go to the mic if you want to ask a question. They're here and here, just because we're still recording.
So that was fabulous and
Thank
just
you.
so exciting. I keep looking at the image and thinking about the unseen participant in all of this, who is the photographer,
Yeah,
who has this role. And I wanted to just ask you about that. I mean, my thinking, looking at this, is the photographer's role is so key, because the photographer especially has to show the evidence of trance.
Okay.
That the photography in some ways can't be random, or what they release to us can't be random. Does that make sense?
Uh-huh. It can't be trance-like itself, but it needs to record the trance. Mm-hmm. And so how is that balance achieved? Yeah, I mean, think about, try to put yourself in this moment. I try to do it in the lecture. We're there in the snow, right? Françoise is dancing in the distance. Perron and Riopelle are like standing shoulder to shoulder, one with a camera that probably was making some noise. It made a little, kind of winding noise at the time, a camera like that, a Bolex. And then the snapping of the shutter, it would have been, a fairly familiar form of camera with a button that would have made a click at the time. And, so Françoise is there dancing with these observers, otherwise entirely alone in a very quiet space. But it would have been pretty hard to really relax, I think, in that. I mean, I couldn't do that, right? And so, I think it required a huge degree. I mean, this is the ironic thing about automatism or trance states. They require discipline in order to remove oneself from the waking world. And that's why there were certain sort of skillful practitioners and others couldn't do it. André Breton famously could not get into the trance state. It frustrated him. But clearly Françoise is able to access the trance state. And dance is the vehicle for that, and I think also the landscape. So therefore the photographer, on the other hand, is highly conscious and is like a hawk, watching for the right moment. And these are beautiful photographs. I mean, the photographs are a stunning accomplishment, in my opinion. And it's a horrible shame that we can't see the film footage. And yet we can imagine it. So in a sense, we have the footage in our minds. And I think we should engage that kind of dream of the dance. But this is a long discussion in surrealist scholarship, is the role of photography in, I'm going back, excuse me for hopefully not making you dizzy here, in hysteria and the documentation of trance states, right, and the birth of the field of psychology and psychoanalysis. The camera is the scientific instrument here to prove the nature of the trance state. But in, I'm going to go back to Dans la Neige. Here, the camera is an accomplice, right, and not a physician. The camera is a friend, and an intimate friend, I think, in that regard, supporting the trance. I don't know, I would love to hear your response.
Yeah, no, and I think what you're saying is very interesting about it takes the photographer not being in a trance state in order to point the camera appropriately.
Yes.
But it's also for us, it's the way we get to know this happened.
Totally.
Which makes it so important in the history of surrealism, the history of the Automatists.
Yeah, and this is something that I and forgive me for mentioning my book, but there's an organic flow to these ideas. In this book, I talk about the typewriter and the sewing machine. In particular, the typewriter as the mode of what they called enregistrement. Sorry, my pronunciation of that's a difficult word to pronounce, but the registering of the surrealist unconscious. So the surrealists did it too. They would actually take notes, almost stenographic notes. They would write very quickly to try to get the extremely accurate recording of the spoken language. So we have photographs from Man Ray of the trance state, of Desnos, etc. But the real recording device in surrealist language automatism was the typewriter. But you need the camera for the body, right? And Man Ray talks about the camera as a kind of automatic device in itself. Man Ray, the wonderful photographer who did this image and really was the photographer of automatism. And so even though these bodies are not dynamic, you still need that documentation there. It doesn't exist without it, right? It's a dialectic.
Another one from the room, but I'm Jacqueline Sundberg, and at the moment I'm a mouthpiece because I'm voicing a question from one of the online attendees that was sent in advance. And I will just take the moment to encourage anyone else who does have questions who's watching online. You can send them by email to roar.library, roaar.library@mcgill.ca, and I will voice those for you. It's also in the video description. But the question was actually specifically about the refus global. And this attendee is asking, it might be a ways back. I was actually thinking of the transcription, the dance transcription, which was early on in your slides as well. Yeah. But this question is about the refus global and questioning whether the group, and Françoise Sullivan in particular, anticipated the impact that document and really would have. That's the question. Well, and also, though this one is more for Françoise, you don't have to answer. But did the results surpass their hopes?
Did it surpass their hopes?
Yes.
Fascinating. Okay, well we could ask Françoise to respond to that.
Not to put you on the spot, but if you're willing.
if she would like, I would love that. From what I know, it was not anticipated, that response, and it was a shock. But I don't think, Borduas was fired from his job, and I think that was, I think it was probably devastating in ways that are hard for us to imagine. And yet I think in the end, the group stood by it, and we're proud of, they didn't regret. You heard me say that Françoise in our interview talks about the evening before publication, some of the 16 signatories were nervous and said maybe we should remove some of this political content, but they didn't. They were remarkably bold and courageous in releasing this document that was so shocking for the time. But I think maybe my guess is that they didn't expect that much of a reaction. And today in the United States, certainly where I teach, it's pretty easy to get fired for saying something in a classroom. So I find that not difficult to believe. But I think it is, I don't know, it is a little bit hard to put ourselves back in this time, of this strictness, the social strictness that is really beyond what probably most of us have experienced in our lifetimes.
We have 2 more questions over here.
Hi, thank you for a wonderful presentation, and it's such an honor to be in your presence. Mine goes back to what we were discussing. As a psychologist, very interested in the trance state,
Yeah.
and I was wondering, I wasn't sure at first whether the dancing put Françoise into a trance state, but what I heard you saying is she put herself into a trance state before. How is that done, and also with the other photos that you showed?
Yeah, this again would be another good moment for all of us to ask the artist, what are the dynamics of the trance state, and Alice Farley, who's sitting next to Françoise, might be able to answer that question as well. And by the way, I want to say, if your question doesn't get answered, I have cards on the table here. If you're online, please, I would love questions, because this is a chapter in progress. Also critiques, I'm totally down with those. So let me know, please be in touch with me, because I would really like to hear from you. But, I tried to give a pretty detailed, forensic recreation of that day, because I'm also fascinated in that question. Françoise arrives on the bus. She's got her coat on. She stays the night before at the Riopelle house. They have dinner. It's lovely. And then the next day, they go out onto the snow, right? There's no preparation. As you heard, it had just been one day prior. And so the coat is removed. It's very cold. And then, they had been walking through the landscape, and I don't know. What is the point at which Françoise says, okay, let's stop, I'm going to start, or does she just start moving? And at what point do the cameras start clicking, And then, what is the sort of, Françoise talks about imagining there's a kind of creation or experience of a building scenario. So as she moves through the landscape, certain aspects of the terrain create different scenarios. So, and I could get more precise. I don't think that the trance was as if she wasn't aware of where she was, because clearly the place is important. So it's a different experience. It's an experience of trance that is highly aware of place. That is, in my mind, like I said, a kind of weather vane or a channeling of the natural world. That the body becomes an instrument for nature, which is doing the automatic writing, right? Does that make sense? I'm talking about a kind of animism. This is an animism. And so linking again to the notion of sort of shamanic or indigenous practices in dance, even though Sullivan is very careful to distinguish her work as contemporary. But channeling and allowing the elements to inhabit, or I wouldn't want to use the word possess, but to move through the body. I don't know how that happens. I would like to experience that, to be honest. And maybe, if there's more dance, we could all kind of begin to understand that, but I think it's probably very unique to dancers.
Okay. Thank you.
Sorry, I wish I could answer more clearly. It's a mystery, and that's the beauty of it. It's a mystery. Thank you.
So
Alice Farley.
I just wanted to say that I've felt in movement, in an environmental situation, it is as if the movements are conjured by space. You're not, there's not a determination of the progress of it, especially initially. If you to really go out into, even if it's a familiar space, it's still, there's a focus when you start performing. And when originally, when I did that Land's End piece on the cliffs, I felt like it was the bit of risk. I was interested in the idea of risk. I was interested in the idea of what performance is or what is rehearsal. Why is it so different? Why is it, it's completely different. And when there's the eye of the other is upon you, something it can approach such a focus that it's almost a trance. And then, and to something comparable was to be on the edge of a cliff. You know, the movement you do in the dance studio is one thing. When you actually are up 500 feet, it's another thing. And the point of it, for me, it was not for a photographer who becomes like the voyeur. The point was your communication with nature that is, it makes you, you're taken into some conversation of another sort. And then when later on I worked in situations that were not so dangerous situations, but I feel like the presence that you can actually can become aware of from nature will change how the movement comes out. And it's not it's not a metaphor, it's a reality, you know, when you pay attention.
I thank you, Alice Farley. Thank you. I recommend that everybody read Danse et l'Espoir, because I think it holds some answers to these questions. And Françoise talks a lot about the connection to the cosmos there. The word animism isn't used, but this notion of dance is a kind of weaving together of spaces, of microcosms, macrocosms, of present, place, and a place beyond. It's very helpful to read. It's a beautiful text, a real achievement.
Yes, very much enjoyed the synthetic associations that you made, etc., Professor Abigail. But I want to, I was so curious to know, why are those singular two words, abstract expressionism, never used in your text?
Oh, interesting.
Because it's curious. You do, of course, bring surrealism into the contemporary world as a viable contemporary movement and sensibility. But I'm curious to know, I'm not questioning the lecture as much as pointing out that, you know, the ABEX ethos, including everyone from Motherwell to Rothko. Of course, Motherwell has written extensively in his multi-volumed text. But certainly Rothko, the heroic sublime, all of that was infused with surrealism. Yeah. So I'm just curious to know if you view it as a parallel movement or et cetera. Okay.
Thank you for that question. Well, shout out to any of my students if you're here listening, because right now I'm teaching a class on post-war American art. And I would be in class right now, and I'm not there. So I'm here instead. And that class is all about ABEX and really focuses on those artists you mentioned. And I was just in Houston for the conference of the International Society for the Study of Surrealism just a few days ago, and was at the McGill, where I got to kind of bathe in Rothko and Twombly and Newman, and it was great. So certainly there's a relevance there, not only for surrealism, but also for les automatistes. I view les automatistes as predating abstract expressionism, right? So it's it's before ABEX really gets a name, and in that regard, les automatistes should be more well known in art history, in North American art history, as an absolutely crucial step in the post-war period between surrealism in Europe, exiled surrealism during the war, and then what happens to surrealism when we land in American soil, right? And when American artists begin to take it up. And it's sort of like les automatistes are like a missing link in that puzzle, because they're often overlooked in that history from wartime surrealism straight into ABEX and Pollock, et cetera, right? So maybe I didn't mention it because they get so much attention. And I wanted to, obviously the talk is more about Sullivan than Les Automatistes, and there's a huge, if you're interested in Les Automatistes, there's so much there. There are so many good books on Borduas and Riopel and others. Ray Ellenwood's work on the group is just outstanding, and I don't know if Ray Ellenwood is here. I would probably faint if Ray Ellenwood, because the work is astoundingly detailed and astute. I really wanted to focus on this other group. But yes, I think, you saw that I kind of went to after with Darren and with Surrealist Dance, but the afterword of, and I'll go back to that amazing Riopel score, the afterword of Les Automatistes is actually, I prefer, where is it? It's in the beginning. Excuse me for clicking around. Look, it's quite, it has that feeling maybe almost of a Motherwell drawing or something. That we could see in these moments, and it's there too because Sullivan's in New York and other members of the group go to New York. Les Automatistes go to New York and try to meet with Breton, etc. There is interaction between people who will become Abex painters and Les Automatistes. But in a way, my kind of question would be, what does Abex take from them? I would be interested in that kind of reverse. But it's a great question. Yeah. Who in particular, I would be interested to know, did anyone in particular focus on Riopel? Was it Motherwell or?
Motherwell significantly, and I knew Motherwell.
Okay, that's great.
It was very much a conscious, ongoing leitmotif in his.
Wonderful. Maybe with Riopel in particular, between Riopel and. Okay, thank you so much. It's a whole world. It's a whole world, this subject of Les Automatistes here in Quebec.
Thank you again. It's come to that time. We'll stop questions, but as you said, you are ready for any after the talk. I'd now like to welcome Claude Gosselin for the thank you and goodbye. Thank you.
Well, what a good speech and a good lecture. And thank you very much for Abigail to make sure that our artists from Montreal are also competent on the international scene. So we need people like you to be interested in people in Montreal, the arts that is being done and is doing in Montreal that could reach some other audiences. Alors, je vais continuer en français. Je sais que maintenant on est à McGill, une université qui promet le français maintenant. Alors, au nom de l'Université McGill et du Centre international d'art contemporain de Montréal, que je dirige, nous remercions Abigail Susik pour la conférence qu'elle vient de donner sur Françoise Sullivan et la place qu'a joué le surréaliste dans les années 1940 à Montréal. Nous avons été très honorés de l'implication qu'Abigail Susik a démontrée à l'égard des artistes de Montréal dans la perspective unique et originale que ceux-ci et celles-ci ont développée à l'égard du surréalisme tel que défendu à Paris par Breton spécialement. Nous remercions Abigail Susik pour apporter sur une scène internationale une information essentielle sur l'apport des artistes de Montréal à un courant fondamental de l'histoire de l'art contemporain. Nous vous invitons à suivre les recherches d'Abigail Susik sur son site web. Elle a un magnifique site web. Toutes ses recherches sont mentionnées sur le site, les publications et les articles de journaux importants. Alors, et elle nous annonce que d'autres articles vont suivre très bientôt, entre autres cette publication sur Françoise Sullivan. Enfin, je remercie mes collègues de l'Université de McGill pour avoir cru dans ce projet et pour l'avoir co-réalisé avec le Centre international d'art contemporain de Montréal. Alors, Christine Ross, merci. Gwendoline Owens, merci. Voyons. Elle n'est pas ici, je ne la vois pas, là, mais bon. Jacqueline, oui, je la cherche, mais en tout cas, Bon, alors merci beaucoup pour mettre tous vos efforts pour cette soirée, c'est merveilleux. Et je ne pourrais terminer ces remerciements sans mentionner Françoise Sullivan, quand même, hein, qui au cours de ces 75 dernières années nous a alimentés avec des créations audacieuses en danse, en art visuel, en photographie, en peinture. À ce sujet, je vous invite à aller voir sa magnifique exposition au Musée des beaux-arts de Montréal, des œuvres réalisées au cours de cette année et des 2 dernières, un magnifique travail de titan. Merci Françoise, merci Abigail. Et en terminant, je dis le financement de cette activité a été assumé par l'Université McGill, la collection d'art visuel, les bibliothèques et le département d'histoire de l'art et des communications de l'université, et les amis du Centre international d'art contemporain de Montréal. Merci à toutes ces personnes impliquées dans la culture et pour la culture. Merci à tous, à vous tous qui êtes venus participer à cette soirée, et merci à tous ceux qui sont à leur ordinateur à nous regarder. Merci.